So, you're really serious about learning biochemistry, hey? Well, welcome to our first lesson of our biochemistry crash course. Lesson 1, Building Blocks of Life. Wait, you're wanting to teach me all of biochemistry? Where on earth do you even begin? Well, great question, little green creature. What I think we really need to start off with is to talk about what all the biochemical stuff is made of. And so this lesson will talk about the 4 chemicals that make up all of biochemistry: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. So are you ready? This is going to be our introduction to biochemistry. Now get this. Everything in life is made up of these 4 things: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. I'll say it again for the people out the back who can't hear. Everything in life is made of these 4 things: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. And that's it. You know all of biochemistry and you can go home now. These are what we call the 4 major macromolecules. And essentially every single cell is made up of these 4 ingredients. It's like baking bread. You need flour, water, salt, and yeast. And that is the basic ingredients to make bread. Well, to make life, these are the 4 basic ingredients: lipids, carbohydrates, protein, and nucleic acids. And so these 4 things are essentially the building blocks of all of life. And all biochemical reactions essentially use or transform one of these basic building blocks. Now, these are called macromolecules because they're big molecules, but they are all larger structures made up of smaller subunits. And these smaller subunits are what we do and change around in all our biochemical reactions. So let me tell you what I mean. Lipids, or fats, are essentially chains of carbons. So you can see here carbon atom, carbon atom, carbon atom, carbon atom. You chain a bunch together and you get a fatty acid, which is the basic building block of a lipid. Carbohydrates are a chain of sugars. So for example, glucose. And this is a chain of sugar, 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 sugar. And sugar itself is made of carbon. That's right, we are carbon-based life forms. Proteins are also a chain of something. And in this case, there are a chain of amino acids. And so amino acid, amino acid, amino acid, you chain them together, you get a protein. And nucleic acids are a chain of nucleotides. And so you chain together these nucleotides and you get nucleic acids. And so basically in biochemistry, we have a bunch of molecules that are made of carbon and arranged in different ways. And by arranging them in different ways, you get these 4 major macromolecules: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. And so this entire video will essentially be about these 4 things. So let's get into it. Part 1, lipids. So like I said, lipids are chains of carbon atoms. Let me illustrate that for you. Here is a chain of carbon atoms. Here is also a chain of carbon atoms. One is a short chain, one is a long chain. We call these chains fatty acids. Okay, so this is the basic building block of lipids and fats, which are fatty acids, chains of carbons. Now let's get a little bit technical here. In chemical notation, this is what a fatty acid looks like. So you can see we have these carbons, 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 but we also have these hydrogens hanging off, and we have this weird oxygen thing going on over here. So this bit over here is called a carboxyl group, and the rest of this chain is called a hydrocarbon chain. And it's called a hydrocarbon chain because it has hydrogens stuck onto carbon. So in chemical notation, this is what a fatty acid looks like. Now, chemists sometimes get a bit lazy and decide to represent this diagram without all the letters. And so you might see diagrams like this. In these kinds of organic chemistry diagrams, every single joining point of a line represents a carbon, and it's assumed that the hydrogens are hanging on. So these 2 things are actually the same. We have our carboxyl group over here and the hydrocarbon chain. So these 2 are the same. Chains of carbons with hydrogens hanging off them. Now, fatty acids, which are those chains of carbons, are usually stored as fat. So here's my artistic depiction of fat. It's a blob of fat. For example, butter or olive oil or ghee. Take your favorite fat. Now, if we zoom in, here's what we see. This is what a fat molecule actually looks like. So in yellow over here, you'll see that we have our 3 fatty acid chains. So these are all fatty acid chains, 1, 2, and 3. And then holding them together is this backbone, which we call glycerol, and that's made of 3 carbons. And so 3 fatty acid chains attached onto a glycerol backbone is what we call a triglyceride. Tri meaning 3, glyceride. 3 fatty acids attached onto a glycerol. And this is essentially the molecule called fat. Now, there are other arrangement of lipids. So we talked about the triglyceride with its glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acid chains. Another arrangement is if we take the fatty acids and stick it onto a phosphate. And this is what we call phospholipids. So you have a phosphate head and 2 fatty acid tails, and that's what we call a phospholipid. And the last type of lipid that you'll see in your body is a thing called cholesterol. And that's when we take the carbon chain and arrange it in this characteristic 4-ring structure. So you've got a ring here, a ring here, a ring here, a ring here, a little wavy thing over here, and that's cholesterol. And so these are the 3 main types of lipids that we see in our body. But at the end of the day, they are all made up of chains of carbons. So you got that? Clear as mud? Great. So now you know everything you need to know about lipids for now. So let's talk about our second macromolecule, carbohydrate. Love a good bowl of pasta, full of carbs, carbohydrates. Carbs are made up of sugars, and the technical fancy name for a sugar is saccharide. The most basic unit of sugar is called a monosaccharide. Mono meaning 1, so 1 sugar. For example, glucose. This is probably the most important example. And glucose is essentially 6 carbons in a little ring, like a little hexagon, a nice green hexagon. Carbon, 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 carbon. 6 carbons make a glucose. Now in chemical notation, this is what glucose looks like. So you got the 6 carbons, a few oxygens, and a few hydrogens. In total, you have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And so its formula is C6H12O6. Just as water is H2O, glucose is C6H12O6. But anyway, who cares? Don't worry about that. This is the important thing, 6 carbons in a hexagon, glucose. Now, monosaccharides, glucose was our first example, but we have others such as fructose or galactose. Now, we can combine 2 monosaccharides together to make a disaccharide, di meaning 2. And so you combine a glucose and a fructose and you get sucrose. You combine glucose and a galactose and you make lactose. Now, I'm lactose intolerant and I have to eat this stupid medication called lactase to help me process milk products. Anyway, so you join 2 glucose molecules together and you get maltose. Now, what we can do is join a whole bunch of monosaccharides together in a huge chain to make a polysaccharide. And so examples of polysaccharide include starch, which is what potato and wheat and everything's made of. It's the most widely consumed carbohydrate in the world. And we have glycogen, which is how our body stores glucose. It will stack a whole bunch of glucose together in this tightly formed ball for storage, and that's called glycogen. And we'll talk a lot about glycogen later. And so this is an overview of all of carbohydrates in biochemistry. So now you know what carbohydrates are made of. Everyone happy? All right, because now we're talking about proteins. What's a protein? Proteins are made up of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids. And when you combine all these 20 amino acids together, you get a big 3D structure, which I've drawn here for you. If you unravel this big ball, this big 3D structure, what you get is a chain of amino acids. And we call this chain a polypeptide. I'll tell you why in a second. But first, what are amino acids? Well, let me show you the chemical structure of the 20 amino acids. These guys are the 20 amino acids. They all have the same basic structure involving carbon and nitrogen. And you can see glycine, this is the basic structure. And every single amino acid will have the same basic structure. But they'll each have different side chains hanging off. So they'll all have different shapes and different arrangements of carbons and other molecules that attach off the main basic backbone that give them all different chemical properties. And so the 20 amino acids have different chemical properties. To make a protein, we join amino acids together in a sequential process. So for example, glycine joined to alanine joined to valine. The bond between 2 amino acids are called a peptide bond. And that's why when we put together a chain of amino acids, we call it a polypeptide because it's a chain made of many peptide bonds between amino acids. And then the chemical properties of each amino acid reacts with one another, and it causes it to fold up into a 3D structure. The sequence of amino acids in a polypeptide will determine the protein structure, which then determines the protein's function. And so that's all I'll say about proteins. Proteins are a chain of amino acids joined together that then fold up into a 3D shape. And finally, let's bring it home and talk about nucleic acids, the fourth and final macromolecule. Now, the most famous nucleic acid is DNA. It's the genetics molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, DNA has a lesser known younger brother called RNA, which stands for ribonucleic acid, which is equally important in the way that our cells work. And basically, DNA is a sequence of 4 nucleotide bases, A, T, G, and C. And the sequence of these 4 bases form our genetic code. Now, I won't go into too much detail about nucleic acids, but I'll show you the structure. Let's say we take a bit of DNA and we untwist this double helix and we lay it all out. What does that look like? Well, first of all, we get this backbone, right? So if you imagine this orange strip and this red strip, if we ironed it out, we'd get these 2 backbones. And this backbone consists of alternating sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate. So green pentagon, orange circle, green pentagon, orange circle, green pentagon. The sugar here is a sugar known as deoxyribose. It has 5 carbons in it, compared to glucose, for example, which has 6 carbons. And here we have phosphate, which I've drawn as an orange circle. And so we get deoxyribose phosphate, deoxyribose phosphate. That's the backbone. And so each strand will have this backbone. In between the backbone are our 4 nucleotide bases, A, T, C, and G. Their real names are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And in DNA, there's a base pairing rule. A always pairs with T, so this A and T will pair together. This T and A will pair together. And G always pairs with C, so C and G, G and C. So that's the structure of DNA. Now, RNA is even more simpler. It's just a single-stranded molecule, and so instead of 2 strands, we have 1 strand, and again, it's a sugar-phosphate backbone. And the backbone is the same as DNA, except instead of deoxyribose, we have a ribose as the sugar. It's a slightly different sugar, again, 5 carbons, ribose phosphate, ribose phosphate, ribose phosphate, and attached to it are our nucleotide bases. The bases are exactly the same, except U replaces T. So instead of ATCG, it's AUCG, or GC, as I've written here. And that's all I'll say about nucleic acids. And so that is a whirlwind tour of everything that makes up all the biochemicals that we'll talk about. So little green creature, does that make sense to you? Let's summarize that. Let's summarize everything. And basically what you need to know is that everything in life is made up of these 4 things: lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Lipids are a chain of carbons, carbohydrates are a chain of sugar, proteins are a chain of amino acids, and nucleic acids are a chain of nucleotides. Now, I won't talk about nucleic acids at all. That's more of a genetics and molecular biology topic. And we won't talk about proteins all that much as well. I have a separate molecular biology crash course, but we're not going to talk about that right now. In our biochemistry course, we'll talk mainly about lipids and carbohydrates and how our body uses that and turns that into energy and so on and so forth. And so this is our introduction to biochemistry, the 4 major macromolecules that make everything up. I've got here a written summary if you want to read things. I'll put it up here, and here's the second slide of that, and that's it. See you in the next video.